So let's take a detour into the world of behavioral economics, thinking about the two-system brain and its shortcuts. And I'm basing most of this on Thinking Fast and Slow, the best-selling book by Daniel Kahneman, one of the fathers of behavioral economics. So the basic overview is, look, when is it correct to assume that humans are rational? If you think about our decisions, the cost and benefits of all decisions are sometimes pretty complex. So the quality of our decisions depends on how well we understand and can make sense of those costs and benefits. And like most of us, deciding about having children, it's a very complex decision. Here's an example of how we sometimes go awry with our rational decision making. A sunk cost, you may have heard about this, it's a cost that has already been incurred and you cannot recover it. So what should we do with these sunk costs? Ignore them in future decisions. This is very hard for humans to do, but for instance, if you lose your concert tickets, the $80 that you've already spent on them is irrelevant to the decision about, for instance, whether you need to replace them if they get lost. Or to put a finer point on it, let's say you and your bae have been dating for 4 years and you've never been happy, but it feels like that 4 years is something that you should count, right? You shouldn't give up on this relationship. We spent 4 years in it. Well, economists would say, if you're unhappy and your future goal is happiness, what you've already spent making yourself unhappy is irrelevant. So there's a lot of business decisions like this. You've spent $5 million on this project and you'd hate to see that go to waste by closing the project down, but that might be the smartest thing to do. So this is where we're going to play. We assume humans are mostly rational, but a rational decision maker has to have perfect information. Are there limits to human rationality? We think so, and that's what behavioral economics seeks to get into. But not so fast, you might say. Sometimes things that look irrational might actually be rational, and that is true. So when humans are thinking about what rationally gives us the most benefits compared to the cost, sometimes we need to factor in things about fairness. And sometimes we're willing to sacrifice our own well-being to uphold the quality of fairness. Another idea is that we have rationality, but it's bounded by what we know. What we don't know is probably more than we do know. So the idea that we do the best we can given the information we can is kind of makes sense, right? The effort of finding, getting the information needed to be perfect with our decisions would just be too costly. And then another reason that we may look irrational but not really be irrational is that some of us are very risk averse. So we're willing to pay a lot to avoid an uncomfortable outcome. One of my favorite questions when it comes to this stuff is, okay, let's just give us the benefit of the doubt and say we're rational, self-interested creatures. The self-interest that we describe, are we serving the current self? Are we serving our future self? Because in some of our decisions, we cannot serve both of those at the same time. That next milkshake or, steak tartare or something that might have a different impact on the future health versus current taste buds. Those are real decisions. Your exercise, your choice of housing, all sorts of things really matter. And it can be hard to balance the future you's needs versus the current you's needs. So let's set some guidelines. The term irrational, let's use that for the situation where a person chooses an option that makes her worse off. So that's the framework we'll use. And now we have, through research and studies in behavioral economics, figured out where the predictable patterns of what looks to be irrationality are. And really, these are shortcuts that we take. Shortcuts because of the complexity of the decision making. And we take these shortcuts to save us time and effort. Let's start by comparing actual human behavior to idealized rational economic behavior. Are we more likely to resemble Homer Simpson or Spock? Well, here's what it would look like if we were always Spock. On the left, we are going to use our system 2. We'll talk about that in a minute. For all of our decisions, we carefully weigh costs and benefits. We're not subject to biases. We do a good job weighing costs and benefits equally. We're not influenced by our current state, like being hungry or tired. We may discount costs and benefits that occur in the future, and we only use costs and benefits to make our decisions. But if we're more like the Homer Simpson human, sometimes irrational beings that behavioral economists think that we are, we use system 1. We'll talk about that, our gut instinct, to make many decisions. We will rely on past shortcuts to make future judgments. We are subject to biases. We tend to weigh losses greater than gains. So depending on the direction of the gain or loss, it matters if it's a plus or a minus. And just to be clear, if we are econs, if we are perfectly rational, it wouldn't depend which direction the plus or the minus was going. The gain or loss should still be the same weight. And we tend to bias to the default. So whatever we currently have, that tends to be a real heavy anchor for us. And we may have self-control problems and be subject to what we call present bias, which means valuing present consumption way more than future consumption, being willing to give up a lot in the future so that we can have it today. And that can make for inconsistent decisions. And finally, we may make decisions based on emotional states or context, like what we believe is fair in the moment or other emotional factors. Which, by the way, is not to say that emotions are irrational. It's rather to say that our emotional states can change and can be fairly inconsistent from day to day, and that's going to change how our decisions look. So let's revisit the idea of two systems. So in the work of behavioral economics and psychology, there's a theory that the human brain works on two different speeds, basically. We start with system 2. This is the newer part of the brain, probably located maybe in the frontal lobes. It is the bigger, slower processor. It requires more effort, and you can think of it as requiring more blood sugar. So it is going to require more fuel, and that makes it something that for survival we tend to not want to use too much. So for survival, we outsource decisions often to system 1, which is our gut instinct, our older animal part of our brain. And so system 1, which is, again, instinctual, ends up handling a lot of decisions. In some cases, decisions that she shouldn't handle. All right, here's a little game. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does each cost? Think about it and then answer quickly. A, 10 cents and $1. B, 5 cents and $1.05. C, 1 cent and 1.09. Pause. Most people answer A, but that would be incorrect. B is the correct answer. What's going on here? Well, I don't know what you answered, but if most people usually answer A, we're looking at a math problem that looks on its face a little simpler than it really is. So it could be that system 1 took over when system 2 was really the correct part of the brain to use. So let's meet system 1. System 1 is sassy, intuitive, quick. It's an older part of the brain, and it's absolutely necessary for survival. So making sense of patterns, very quick response time, cutting through a lot of noise to get to an answer, absolutely necessary when you're dealing with issues of safety, issues of who to trust, issues of basic human survival. Is it the right engine to use when dealing with complicated political arguments or political polarization or really complex issues? Probably not. And yet our brain wants to use system 1 whenever it can to save glucose for a rainy day. There's all sorts of interesting research with respect to system 1, but it links with cognitive ease. So a funny thing is that Just because you feel like you understand something or you feel relaxed about understanding a pattern of causality, for instance, it may not really be true. It may just be that you're seeing a pattern. Your system one is seeing a pattern and you have a certain mood about it. Narrative and causality is an important one. As we get older, as we're figuring out the world, we come up with narratives, or we're told narratives, and sometimes those are oversimplified. I think we all know that one by now. But we're also moldable. So we can be molded on our sort of knowledge and reflexive understanding of patterns and how the world works can be molded by repetition and written words. And it's almost like we can't really control this. If you give students words to focus on, if you give them a list of words to look at before they move on to their next class, and you make those words be things like blue, gray hair, walker, elderly, things associated with being old as a human, you will find that they walk to classes a little more slowly, measurably more slowly than if you were given a list of other words. So there's some interesting, lots and lots of interesting experiments that go around with this stuff. So our decisions are moldable, which is wild. For instance, advertisers know this very well. Commercials work better when you're tired. When your brain is being used up, when your bandwidth is sort of already being taken, you are more likely to accept biased perspectives simply because you don't have the processing bandwidth of System 2 to help you out. This is Warren G. Harding, one of the worst presidents we've ever had in the U.S. And he's up here because he represents the halo effect. So some of the dangers of over-reliance on System 1 are that you pass a snap judgment on somebody, and then just because they wowed you with how they look and maybe their on-fleek eyebrows and their strong jawline, you think they're an effective leader, and all the future evidence will have to go against your very strong initial impulse. We can be overconfident. We systematically underestimate workload and we overestimate ourselves, both in time and in almost all the ways we can do this. We trust our gut instinct far too much. We are crappy planners. Our ability to forecast is poor and always too optimistic. If you're a procrastinator, know that you are not alone. This is probably, for all intents and purposes, the default human way of being, simply because we cannot make the decisions and make the predictions as well as we wish we could, as well as we think we can. A very interesting shortcut that we take that ends up sometimes being a problem is this idea of misassigning probabilities. So, for instance, here this is the famous Linda problem as told in Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Imagine a young woman named Linda who is single, outspoken, and very bright, and who, as a student, was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. Is she more likely to be A, a bank teller, or B, a bank teller active in the feminist movement? Think about it for a minute. Answer in your head, and then I'll tell you what most people say. Most people say B, bank teller active in the feminist movement, but that is incorrect. B, by definition, is a subset of A. All bank tellers are in the bigger outer circle, and bank tellers active in the feminist movement are obviously a subset of that, and so they're a smaller group. So it's mathematically impossible for B to be the correct answer. And yet, what are we doing? We're matching patterns. We're saying, oh, she looks like an activist, and I'm going to put her in the activist without thinking about the mathematical probability. Another example of this power of narrative and power of pattern repetition is this cancer question. The cancer rate in a rural Pennsylvania town is higher than Philadelphia. As is true of most rural areas in Pennsylvania, the population is more conservative and water comes from wells rather than from the Great Lakes. So if you're like most humans, you probably started generating narratives about policies, perhaps about maybe no regulation on the wells because it's a conservative place, and any number of narratives. But the reality, and that what economists would say would be the right thing to do, is to first ask, before you generate narratives, is ask, okay, are there other small towns with higher cancer rates? Or should we be thinking about the law of averages, that a large town like Philadelphia is going to have an average cancer rate, and any small outlying area with fewer people is bound to have a below or above the average rate. So you'd want to get a bigger picture before you started generating too many narratives and doing too much work figuring out the problem, because there may not actually be a problem. And have you ever had that problem of it feeling like forever to wait for that goodie right now? And then later on you think back on it and you're like, that was just 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, an hour. How could I possibly have been so thirsty about that thing, right? That's how we are weird with time. A 5-minute wait feels different when it's now versus a 5-minute wait a week from now or a year from now. That's why it's very hard for some people to start their retirement savings if they have enough cash. You should start it early, but it feels like difficult to do that. It feels difficult to forego the money now. It feels easier to forego $10 next week than it does right now. But that's something weird that humans do with time. Hyperbolic discounting. We don't treat time the same in the future as we do today. Something that economists are finding also is that we are competitor-oriented, so that oftentimes we can't stop ourselves from being competitive. And there are some gender aspects to this as well, but you might like to know that in matriarchal societies, it's the women that tend to be a little more hyper-competitive than the men. So it depends on who sort of is seen as the elite or the more powerful of the genders. So coming to the bottom of this, a lot of it is that cost-benefit analysis is just difficult when the feedback is not immediate. Think about deciding about building a space shuttle, or building an interstate roadway, or building high-speed rail across the country. These are decades-long projects. These have, cost runs into the billions of dollars. Not clear what the benefits are or if we'll ever be able to really calculate them, but in most of those cases, the benefits outweigh the cost. And so it's difficult to get the project done. This is one of the big reasons why government exists, to fund projects like this, to force us to pay for the things that we wouldn't otherwise pay for, although we all know that we want and need going into the future for a lot of good reasons. Humans are funny about wanting to punish those who seem unfair. So all sorts of research about how we are willing to give up some of our well-being to hurt somebody else who we think has violated this rule. And that should be obvious why that may be irrational, at least in the short run. But we do it. And another key finding of behavioral economics is that there is no neutral decision. Every decision has some sort of framing with it. In other words, when you roll up to a counter, things are in a particular order, and that order will influence what you choose. And there's no way to get them out of an order. Somebody has to put them in some order. Deliberate or not, they're in an order that's going to affect your decision. Everything is framed. One of the early entrees of behavioral economics was this idea of loss aversion. That isn't it weird and irrational that a $10 loss in the stock market hurts you more than a $10 gain in the stock market helps you? Emotionally, at least, yes. And in fact, it is about a 2-to-1 ratio. Losses hurt about twice as much as gains help. So that could explain a lot of things, stock market bubbles. That could explain all sorts of willingness to pay for insurance to avoid accidents, or to avoid the pain of accidents at least. All sorts of things that humans do to prove that we are pretty loss averse. And why that can be a problem is that since we're oversensitive to the loss, it leads us to be unwilling to move on. And for those of you that want to do a little proof on this, this is the famous Allais question. Which would you choose? A 61% chance to win $520,000 or a 63% chance to win $500,000? Or, so make your decision. And notice how it's framed. It's framed as a gain. Now, on the second part, which would you choose? A 98% chance to win $520,000 or a 100% chance to win $500,000? Most people choose A in the first and B in the second and prove themselves to be loss averse. So, before we despair of humans, it seems to be kind of working for us. There's some problems. Definitely long-term discrimination can probably trace some of its roots to some of this overuse of System 1, but there are some good things that come from System 1 as well. Is not an engine of capitalism the taking of risks? Entrepreneurship requires risk-taking, which requires people to be a little foolish sometimes when taking risks. Being overly optimistic? Check. And my favorite point of all of this is that self-interested, rational creatures very often will steal each other's stuff. But we don't do that. We do, but we don't do it as much as the economic models predict. We are more trustworthy than all of our models suggest. So there you go.